My name is Mariah. I remember the exact moment the betrayal landed. My father, his hand outstretched, voice soft and coaxing, asking for something I had never expected to be mine to refuse. My heart clenched beneath the calm I showed. I smiled at him because I had learned long ago that a woman's composure can hide a war. The living room smelled of old leather and the faint tang of his cologne, and outside, the autumn light fractured through blinds, catching dust motes like sparks in slow motion. I nodded politely, and in that silence I knew they didn't see me. They never had. Before we move on, I need to be honest with you. My heart sank when I saw that 99% of you watch my videos but don't subscribe. It truly means the world when you do. It helps stories like this find the people who need them. So please take a second to subscribe. And don't forget to tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing your locations. It reminds me that stories really do connect us, no matter where we are. My name is Mariah. The first time I realized the weight of what I'd inherited, it wasn't in numbers, it was in silence. The call came mid-afternoon, sunlight slicing across the apartment in long, pale streaks. I remember the light catching a speck of dust, a single particle hovering in the golden haze, and I thought, almost instinctively, that the world had paused just for me. The lawyer's voice was steady, formal, courteous, but behind it, I heard the undertone, that trembling hush that comes only with secrets. My grandparents had passed, and I was named the sole heir of $38 million. $38 million I had never dreamed I'd touch, never dared imagine in my quiet, careful life. I sank into the couch, the fabric pressing against my palms like a gentle admonishment. There was a scent in the room I didn't recognize. Old paper, the faint musk of polish from a neighbor's vacuum, and the faint trace of my own perfume, a delicate vanilla that clung stubbornly to my skin. I let the number roll over me in silence, letting it settle into every nerve, every muscle. And yet I felt a creeping unease. The inheritance wasn't just a gift. It was a test. And my family, my parents, were waiting at the edges of that test, watching. When they arrived, I greeted them with the calm that comes from years of masking. My mother's smile was too wide, my father's handshake too firm, as if they were trying to imprint themselves onto the moment. They brought flowers I hadn't asked for, their petals brushing against the rim of the vase in my living room, making that soft clicking sound like punctuation in some unsaid argument. They asked casual questions about my day, my work, my life, all the while circling the truth I hadn't voiced. I answered politely, carefully, measuring each word. "I'm proud of you, Mariah," my mother said, but I saw the flicker in her eyes, the calculation hiding beneath warmth. My father nodded, his hands folded like a judge waiting to deliver a verdict. "Your grandparents left something important for you," he said. And in that statement there was both pride and claim, both blessing and demand. My chest tightened, a slow, steady pressure, like the tide pressing against a fragile sandcastle. I sipped my tea, the steam curling toward my face, warm and sharp against the chill in my chest. The tea's bitterness mirrored the taste of suspicion in my mouth. I had learned long ago to read beyond smiles and polite words, to feel the unsaid. I realized then, as I looked at their faces framed by the slanting light, that they did not see me as I was. They saw a conduit, a repository, a safe passage for their ambitions. I let the silence stretch, letting my eyes wander to the window where sunlight fractured over the hardwood floor. Dust danced in the shafts of light, tiny sparks of awareness I clutched onto. I could almost hear my own heartbeat over the polite murmurs of my parents, steady and unyielding. Then my father leaned forward slightly, voice lowered, tone casual, casual enough to disguise intent. "You know, Mariah, we were thinking. Maybe it's time the family shared what's rightfully ours." I froze. The words were soft, unassuming, but they carried the weight of expectation, entitlement, and threat. A flicker of the old hurt, childhood betrayals, being the responsible one, the invisible scapegoat, surged through me. My hand rested on the rim of my cup, knuckles white against porcelain, and I realized that my inheritance, the treasure of my grandparents' lifetime, was already under siege. I smiled, calmly. The kind of smile that does not promise innocence but conceals a storm. And as the afternoon light stretched across the room, highlighting every crease, every shadowed intention, I understood this was the beginning. Not just of a fight over money, but a test of loyalty, of character, of patience. And I had learned through years of quiet observation how to wait, how to plan. The sound of my father clearing his throat snapped me from the reverie. I looked up, and for a split second, I saw the shift, just a flicker, in his expression. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Enough to know that he had miscalculated, and in that moment, I made a decision. I would not yield. Not now. Not ever. I let my eyes drift to the floor, watching the dust move in the slanted light. Outside, a crow cawed, sharp and sudden, and the sound seemed to echo inside the room, a herald of the storm to come. The first move had been made, and I was ready. The next morning, sunlight crept across my kitchen counter, cold and deliberate, cutting the shadows into neat rectangles. I made coffee, the aroma sharp and grounding, letting the warmth seep into my hands before I held the mug close to my chest. I needed it, not for the caffeine, but for the ritual, the small anchor that reminded me I was still Mariah, not a pawn in my parents' quiet campaign. They arrived mid-morning, unannounced but inevitable. Their presence was always immediate, a subtle shift in the air. The faint tang of my mother's perfume, a trace of my father's cologne, both layered with the scent of something older, something calculated. I greeted them with the smile I had perfected over years of disappointment and underestimation. The smile that said, "I see you, but you don't own me, You look well rested," my mother said, eyes glinting. There was warmth in her words, but it danced over the edge of something colder, sharper. The kind of light that makes shadows suddenly longer. My father nodded, leaning slightly against the doorway as if to assert his presence, his fingers brushing the frame like a silent claim. I felt their gaze sweep over me, cataloging, measuring, weighing. I had learned to read those looks like a second language, the soft curl of a lip hiding judgment, a flicker of impatience behind polite eyes. My parents had mastered the art of disguise, warmth to mask entitlement, curiosity to mask scrutiny. And I had learned, over decades of being the responsible one, how to see through it. We sat at the kitchen table, the coffee steaming between us like a fragile veil. They asked questions about work, my friends, my life, and I answered carefully, rhythmically, my words deliberate. I let them speak, letting their own illusions fill the spaces between us, all the while noting what they did not say. It was never what they said that mattered. It was the gestures, the pauses, the subtle shifts in air and attention. "You must understand, Mariah," my father said finally, voice calm, almost too calm. "We've always had the family's best interests at heart." I nodded slowly, lips pressed together. Warmth pooled in my chest, the ironic warmth of someone who knows they are being manipulated. Their best interests rarely included mine. And yet, beneath the polite exterior, beneath the soft words, I could see the glint of expectation, the unspoken belief that I would yield, that I would hand over what my grandparents had entrusted to me. The light shifted in the room as if punctuating the moment, cutting across the table in stripes. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beams, tiny witnesses to the unfolding calculus of intention. My mother brushed her fingers along the edge of the table, nails tapping softly, a metronome for the tension building between us. "You know," she continued, a faint smile curving her lips, "family loyalty is everything. We all must do our part." The words, casual as they were, landed like stones in water. Ripples of anger and recognition passed through me. Loyalty, blood, money. They had mastered the vocabulary of obligation, and yet it rang hollow, like a church bell in an empty hall. I let silence answer them, letting the weight of it stretch, heavy and unbroken. My father shifted in his chair, eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second, a crack in the polished mask. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. It told me everything: their expectation, their entitlement, and their underestimation of me. I sipped my coffee slowly, feeling its warmth burn a path down to resolve. I was learning to play their game, to let their masks reveal themselves, one gesture, one glance, one whispered expectation at a time. They believed they saw me, but they had no idea. And I intended to make them understand eventually, in ways that would leave no room for doubt. As the conversation drifted into safer topics, weather, distant relatives, small updates, I let my mind wander along a darker, quieter path. Every gesture they made, every smile and glance, every casual remark about family obligations was a clue. I cataloged them silently, like a painter tracing shapes in shadow before committing to canvas. And then, just as I thought the morning might dissolve into polite calm, my mother paused mid-sentence, eyes lingering on mine. There was a moment, infinitesimal, yet piercing, where I glimpsed the hunger beneath the charm. It was fleeting, but enough. I realized, fully and sharply, that this was not just a family gathering. It was a battlefield, and in that instant, the first rule became clear. In this game, the masks are everything, and I would see them all. The faint tick of the wall clock marked the shift, the subtle turning of time in my favor. I let my hand brush the edge of the table, fingers lingering on the cool wood. Outside, the light shifted, catching the edge of a window pane, scattering prisms across the floor. I smiled again. Quietly, deliberately, because they had no idea that I was already 2 steps ahead. I learned early that silence is a language few can read, and fewer still can resist. That morning, the apartment felt different. The sun filtered through the blinds in jagged stripes, painting the floor in gold and shadow. I watched it, eyes quiet observer, while my parents circled the room in conversation, their words polite but loaded, gestures subtle but sharp. Every movement became a sentence, every glance a paragraph. I let the coffee cool in my mug, swirling the dark liquid lazily, and listened. My mother's laugh chimed somewhere between melody and accusation, a sound designed to soften the tension while sharpening the knife. My father, leaning back against the counter, nodded slowly at her words, eyes narrowed just so. It was theatrical, a performance I had seen too many times, yet I watched as though seeing it for the first time, savoring every inflection, every beat of pause that revealed intent. I spoke little, answered less. Each phrase was measured, each nod calculated. They believed I was polite, deferential, maybe even naive, but I was neither. I allowed them to talk, to fill the air with their expectations, their unspoken rules of entitlement. And as they spoke, I began the subtle experiment I had been planning. I asked the innocuous questions first. Do you remember Aunt Lorraine's trust fund? My tone was casual, eyes lowered, hands wrapped around the mug. Their reactions were telling. Flickers of recognition, a pause too long, an edge of defensiveness. Tiny cracks. Then I leaned back, just slightly, letting my silence speak for me. My father's fingers drummed against the counter, a soft, rhythmic impatience. My mother's eyes lingered on me longer than necessary, searching for compliance that wasn't there. I let the pause stretch, letting tension thicken in the air like dust in a beam of sunlight. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the game was already in motion. I allowed a word here, a hesitation there, planting seeds to see which truths they would reveal under the guise of casual conversation. They spoke freely, unaware that their honesty was exactly what I needed. Their tone carried entitlement, assumption, and, most revealing of all, the expectation that I would not challenge them. In that moment I saw them clearly. Not my parents, not the people I had called family in childhood, but actors, constrained by greed and old habits, performing loyalty and love like costumes they could remove when convenient. I cataloged every glance, every tremor of tone, every gesture. It was an inventory of betrayal, and it thrilled me in a strange, quiet way. The apartment felt alive with the weight of all that was unsaid. The sunlight shifted across the floor, painting long shadows, highlighting dust that danced lazily in the golden light. I realized then that the shadows themselves seemed to move, in anticipation, as if the room understood what was coming, that I had learned, finally, to play the subtle, invisible game of observation and control. And then, the first real crack appeared. A sentence slipped from my mother's lips without the usual filter. You know, if you really wanted to, you could share. Help us. Help the family. Her voice faltered, betraying more than she intended. I caught it, and the chill that rose in my chest wasn't fear. It was recognition. They believed I was already compromised, pliable, obedient. I smiled, softly, carefully. A gesture of calm, but beneath it, the faint undercurrent of a storm gathering. They didn't see me. They had never really seen me. Later, I stood by the window, fingers pressed lightly against the glass, watching leaves swirl in the autumn wind outside. The city hummed beneath me, indifferent and oblivious. And in that quiet moment, I made the decision that would shape everything. I would let them reveal their true intentions, piece by piece, while I remained a calm, observing force. The first test had been subtle, almost imperceptible, but I knew the next ones would be louder, riskier, more revealing. And as the afternoon sun shifted, casting long, deliberate shadows across the hardwood floor, I felt the weight of inevitability settle on my shoulders. I was no longer just the responsible one. I was a strategist, and the real game was only just beginning. I withdrew. Not in anger, not in fear, but as a matter of necessity. The apartment became a sanctuary, small and muted, the light shifting through sheer curtains like a gentle rhythm. Outside, the city moved in indifferent chaos, unaware that inside, I was cataloging, reflecting, and preparing. The air smelled faintly of vanilla from the candle I lit, a soft anchor in the swirl of thoughts, the quiet hum of my own heartbeat the only soundtrack I allowed. Isolation has a way of revealing truth. In the stillness, I could hear the echoes of years. Every instance I had been overlooked, every demand placed upon me, every subtle dismissal cloaked in concern. The sounds of my parents' voices, their polite manipulations, lingered like ghostly footfalls. I traced them back to patterns, the half-truths, the hidden expectations, the casual gaslighting that had been my inheritance as much as any monetary sum. I walked slowly through my apartment, fingertips brushing shelves and walls, letting textures root me in the present. The polished wood of the floorboards, the rough edge of a stack of notebooks, the cool glass of the windowsill. Each detail became a tactile reminder that I existed outside of their perception, outside of their control. I paused by the window, letting my gaze drift across the city, watching sunlight fracture over brick and asphalt. Life carried on below, unaware, unconcerned, and in that I found clarity. My reflection stared back at me in the mirror across the room, eyes steady, lips pressed, posture poised. I studied the lines of my face, the subtle tension at my jaw, the faint crease of concentration between my brows. They had always seen me as the responsible one, the quiet observer, the one who would yield. But in this stillness, I realized I had agency they could not touch. I could move without their interference, think without their judgment, and plan without their knowledge. I opened a notebook, pen scratching across paper in deliberate rhythm. I wrote down every conversation, every gesture, every hint of expectation or entitlement. I documented it all, not for anyone else, but for myself, every misstep, every subtle threat, every casual mention of family loyalty became a thread I could pull later. By the end of the day, the pages were a map of behaviors, a web of hidden motives, and a blueprint for strategy. Evenings were the hardest. The silence of my apartment amplified the ache of isolation. Shadows lengthened across walls, curling around, corners like fingers, and I felt the weight of being alone in both understanding and resolve. Yet within that quiet, I found a strange comfort. It was here, in this deliberate solitude, that I could reconcile anger with patience, frustration with foresight. I could observe without reaction, catalog without judgment, and plan without interference. And then came the revelation that startled me into stillness. This isolation was not punishment, nor retreat. It was empowerment. Each moment alone was a lesson in patience, a rehearsal for confrontation, a chance to see clearly what others could not or would not. I realized that my parents' assumption that I would be pliable had left me free, unobserved and unseen. In their overconfidence lay their vulnerability. I walked to the window again as the sun dipped low, light softening to amber, dust dancing like fireflies in the beams. My own reflection merged with the shadows, and for the first time in years, I felt entirely present in my body, my mind, my strategy. They believed they were shaping me, controlling me, guiding me. And yet, I had already begun to shape myself, carefully, deliberately, invisibly. And as the room darkened and city lights blinked to life outside, I made a vow to the quiet apartment, to the golden dust, to myself. I would not be dictated to. I would not yield. I would act, but only on my terms. Tomorrow, I will test them again. And this time, I would leave nothing to chance. The confrontation didn't arrive with shouting or slamming doors. It arrived quietly, like a shadow stretching across the room before you notice it. My parents came over that afternoon, the sunlight, slanting low, gold turning to copper through the blinds. I greeted them with my practiced calm, letting the warmth of my smile mask the storm I'd carried through the week. "My, you've been busy," my mother said, voice smooth, polished, like a ribbon sliding over glass. I nodded, tilting my head slightly. The tilt wasn't casual. It was precise, a quiet challenge. Her eyes flicked at the angle and I caught it, the faint flash of impatience that betrayed her control. We sat in the living room, coffee cups cradled in hands that had long ago learned the art of poise. They asked the usual questions about my work, my life, my friends, yet I could feel the weight behind each syllable, the unspoken insistence that I would bend, that I would yield. I let the pauses stretch, letting the silence between sentences work like a lens, magnifying every hesitation, every glance, every micro-expression. "Mariah," my father said eventually, voice calm but loaded, "we've always tried to guide you, help you understand the responsibilities of family." He leaned forward slightly, fingers brushing the edge of the coffee table. That subtle movement was meant to assert dominance, a reminder that I was expected to submit. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, breathing slow, measured. "I understand," I said softly, letting the words hang between us, pliable, neutral. Neutrality was my weapon, a mirror to their intentions. They wanted reaction. They wanted tension. I offered serenity. My mother's lips pressed together briefly. She tried again, softer this time, almost coaxing. "We just thought you might consider helping, supporting the family, the way your grandparents would have wanted." She tilted her head slightly, smile too sweet, eyes too bright. I felt the subtle edge of expectation, of entitlement beneath it, and I let a quiet breath escape me, steady, almost imperceptible. I leaned back slightly, letting the chair creak softly, the sound magnified in the quiet apartment. "I've thought about that," I said slowly, deliberately, "and I've realized that supporting the family is different than giving up my agency." different than surrendering what's meant to be mine. A flicker passed across my father's face. Surprise? Maybe irritation? Maybe a fraction of doubt. My mother's hand tightened on the armrest. The sunlight caught the faint sheen of sweat at her brow. Their masks cracked, just enough. "You don't understand," my father pressed, tone calm but insistent. "The money? It's meant to help everyone. To preserve the family legacy." I smiled, soft, almost imperceptibly amused. "Legacy isn't preserved by taking what isn't yours. Legacy is preserved by integrity, by foresight, by knowing what matters." My words were quiet, but deliberate. Each one weighted with intention. The room shifted. The light through the blinds now carved the space into bars, long, thin, confining, a cinematic prison of our own making. My parents' eyes darted briefly, a microcosm of panic under composure. They realized in that instant that their control was slipping, that the quiet girl they had always underestimated was no longer pliable. For the first time in years, I saw fear, restrained, polite but unmistakable, ripple across their faces. It was subtle, a twitch of a lip, a narrowed eye, a stiffening of posture, but it spoke louder than any shouting match ever could. I let them stew in that revelation. I let it fill the room like incense, filling every corner with the knowledge that I was no longer a passive participant in their performance. My grandparents had entrusted me with more than money. They had left me clarity, foresight, and the means to see truth behind masks. And as the sun slipped lower, light turning to molten copper, I knew. This confrontation was only the first. The game was beginning, and I would not be rushed, coerced, or manipulated. I rose, brushing the edge of the table lightly, leaving the soft imprint of my fingertips. "I'll think about it," I said, letting the words hang like a soft knife in the air. Their smiles, strained, polite, faltered just a little. And I knew they sensed what I did not yet say. The war had begun, and I was already 2 steps ahead. Outside, the wind rattled the blinds, scattering shards of light across the hardwood. I watched them shift, long and deliberate, and for the first time in this house I felt completely, terrifyingly, free. After they left that evening, the apartment felt heavier, charged with everything unsaid. The faint scent of my mother's perfume lingered in corners, a subtle reminder that their presence had been here, that their expectations, demands, and assumptions had seeped into the air. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it for a moment, letting the quiet wash over me, letting the stillness absorb the tension they had brought. I pulled out my notebook, the pages blank but promising, and set to work. Every conversation, every gesture, every subtle attempt to manipulate or coerce was catalogued meticulously. I wrote down their words, the pauses, the glances, the way my father's hand brushed against objects almost unconsciously, the faint quiver of my mother's lips when she thought I wasn't watching. Each detail was a thread in a web of intentions, and I began to map it, line by line, diagram by diagram, until their motives, once hidden behind smiles and polite tones, became visible, almost tangible. The apartment was quiet except for the scratching of my pen against paper. The city outside had settled into the lull of evening, a distant hum of traffic and life. Shadows grew long across the floor, elongating like fingers stretching toward the corners of the room. I watched the light fade, tracing its patterns across the pages, as if the universe itself was highlighting the truth I had begun to uncover. I realized, in that moment, that their greed wasn't subtle. It was layered, sophisticated, but not infallible. Their manipulation had a rhythm, a cadence I could anticipate. They assumed I was pliable, unobservant, incapable of resistance. But every word they had spoken, every expectation they had planted, became a piece of evidence, a clue in the pattern I was assembling. I began to see the structure of their plan, the assumed inevitability, the moral leverage, the implicit threats. And beneath it all, the core of their belief, that I could be intimidated into compliance. I leaned back in my chair, pen poised above the paper, and let my thoughts wander. The memories of childhood floated up. The small betrayals, the unseen slights, the responsibility I had always shouldered silently. Each recollection was a brushstroke on the canvas of understanding I was painting. They had always underestimated me, dismissed my intelligence, assumed my patience was weakness. But patience, I realized, was power when wielded strategically. I sipped from my mug, the warmth grounding me, the bitter taste anchoring me to reality. I thought of my grandparents, their quiet wisdom, the legacy they had entrusted to me. $38 million was more than a sum. It was a statement, a test, a mirror. And I could see clearly now. They had left it to me not only for my security, but because they believed I could navigate the treacherous currents of family with clarity, foresight, and integrity. The night deepened. Shadows thickened, and I continued my mapping. Every note, every arrow, every observation brought me closer to understanding the labyrinth I had inherited. And in the quiet, I felt a strange exhilaration, a mix of fear and excitement, as if the weight of responsibility was transforming into the first spark of power. I closed the notebook at last. The pages filled with meticulous records and careful diagrams. The apartment was bathed in the silver light of the street lamps filtering through the blinds, shadows now elongated, deliberate as my own thoughts. I realized that understanding was the first step toward control, and control was the path to protecting both my inheritance and my dignity. And in that moment, I knew, the next time they came, I would not just observe. I would act. The storm was no longer approaching. It had begun. The days that followed were a study in silence. I moved through my apartment like a ghost inhabiting familiar walls, letting their presence linger without engaging. It wasn't retreat. It was observation, strategy. A slow contraction of my world to its essential edges, a tightening of the lens through which I watched everything unfold. Each sound, each vibration in the city below, each subtle cue from friends or acquaintances outside my family became amplified, cataloged and folded into my growing understanding. They came over again, bright smiles and rehearsed questions, as if they hadn't just tried to claim a fortune that wasn't theirs. I answered politely, deliberately minimal, letting the conversation hover just above tension like a knife suspended in air. The light slanted across the room, amber and fractured, painting their faces in a chiaroscuro of charm and control. Every glance, every tilt of the head, every sigh became data. A map of intentions laid bare and gestures they didn't realize betrayed them. I let them speak, let them probe, let them imagine me pliable. But I did not yield. My silence became a mirror for their expectations. My stillness reflected their impatience. My mother's hand brushed the edge of the table repeatedly, subtle but noticeable, and my father's knee bounced once, twice, betraying the rhythm of a heartbeat I couldn't see but could feel in the room. The world of subtle cues unfolded around me like a hidden language. At night, I retreated further, letting the apartment absorb my energy and focus. I lit a single candle, amber wax melting slowly, letting its faint scent mingle with the cool air drifting through the open window. Outside, the city hummed in indifference, traffic lights pulsing, distant footsteps echoing, sirens weaving a subtle counterpoint to the calm in my sanctuary. Here, alone, I could think clearly, free of their projected expectations, free of the polite manipulations they tried to slip into conversation like poison in water. I began mapping interactions more aggressively, recording patterns not just in writing but in memory, visual cues, tonal shifts, fleeting expressions. I realized that my parents, like all manipulators, were creatures of habit. Their gestures repeated in a rhythm they could not escape. They believed themselves subtle, but subtlety is only effective when the other party does not recognize the pattern. I did. The withdrawal was tactical. I let them believe I was retreating, that their influence over me was more effective than it was. I let the emptiness of my engagement suggest passivity, while I sharpened awareness into a precise instrument. Every encounter, every casual remark, every attempt at coaxing or guilt became a testing ground. And in the shadows of those interactions, I discovered a strange power, anticipation. I could predict with alarming clarity how they would move next. Even my friends noticed my quieter presence. Lunch was short, phone calls brief. I did not explain. I could not explain. The game was too intricate, the stakes too high. The world outside my family's reach remained my refuge, a space in which I could calibrate, reflect, and wait. I became a patient predator, observing, cataloging, and preparing to act when the moment demanded it. And yet, the isolation was not without cost. Nights were long, the city lights slicing across my walls in fragmented beams. I traced the shadows with my fingers, letting them anchor me in the rhythm of patience. Thoughts of past betrayals, old childhood scars, flickered unbidden. The feeling of being dismissed. The countless times my voice had been ignored. The subtle ways I had been shaped to shoulder responsibility without acknowledgement. I let them surface, let them burn in the quiet, and then I transmuted them into strategy. Pain became precision, anger became clarity. By the end of the week, I felt a subtle shift within myself. The withdrawal had achieved more than just observation. It had sharpened my instincts, clarified my intentions, and revealed the weaknesses my parents themselves could not see. I knew now that confrontation could wait. Control, subtle and deliberate, was the first step. I stood by the window that evening, watching leaves twist in the wind, shadows stretching across the streets below. I felt their presence lingering somewhere beyond the glass, unaware that I had already begun to anticipate their next move, already preparing a response that would leave them exposed in ways they could not comprehend. And in that moment, with the city breathing quietly beneath me, I realized the truth I had been waiting to confront. They believed they were guiding me. They believed they could shape me. But the quiet withdrawal had shown me that I was already moving in ways they would never predict. I smiled softly, the candlelight flickering against the walls. The game was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. I found them one evening, hidden in a drawer I had passed 100 times before, tucked beneath old photographs and yellowed letters. Letters from my grandparents, written in a careful hand, ink smudged in places where time had pressed too hard. The envelope was unmarked, ordinary, almost invisible. Yet as I held it in my hands, I felt the weight of decades pressing down on my fingertips. The first letter was simple, almost casual in tone, yet beneath its plain sentences lay meticulous instructions, observations about family behavior, warnings about greed, and notes about character. My grandparents had written about more than money. They had written about people, about patterns, about the subtle ways that entitlement manifests over time. The clarity in their words was startling, almost painful. Every observation, every caution, confirmed suspicions I had nurtured quietly over weeks, the realization that my parents' actions were neither new nor accidental. I spread the letters across the coffee table, candlelight flickering over cursive lines, illuminating the careful folds of paper. Dust motes danced lazily in the golden glow, moving like slow fireflies, as if the apartment itself understood the significance of what I held. I traced their words with my fingertips, each line a path leading deeper into understanding, each paragraph revealing strategies that had been invisible to others but painfully clear to me. Some of the letters contained hidden details about financial arrangements, investments tucked away in the names of distant relatives, discreet trusts meant to protect the family from unscrupulous hands. My grandparents had anticipated greed, manipulation, and the subtle erosion of character over time. They had created safety nets not just for me, but for their legacy, and they had trusted me to recognize them, to act with intelligence and discretion. I felt a quiet thrill at the realization. This was more than inheritance. It was a roadmap, a key to power disguised as guidance. They had left me not just money, but a mirror, a reflection of truth I had never fully possessed before. And in that mirror, I began to see the patterns of my parents' behavior with a precision that felt almost sacred. The revelations were not limited to documents. There were whispers of family history in the margins, subtle indications of unspoken alliances, of loyalty not measured by blood, but by integrity. I read about relatives who had quietly given their time and resources to causes my grandparents cared about, stories of generosity hidden from public view, and the faint outlines of betrayals long past. Each detail sharpened my understanding. Each secret revealed a new layer of complexity in the web of family dynamics. I paused, letting the candlelight wash over my face, warm against the chill of the apartment. The city outside had quieted into the gentle hum of evening. Streetlights flickered on like tiny stars, casting long shadows across the floor. And in that soft, reflective light, I realized the truth. Knowledge was more than power. It was protection. It was a strategy. It was clarity in a world that had often seemed deliberately opaque. I stacked the letters carefully, folding them as they had been, placing them into a neat pile, my fingers lingering on the edges. The shadows around me deepened, curling over walls and floors, emphasizing the contrast between what had been hidden and what I now saw. I understood, with sudden, exquisite clarity, that the next step required subtlety. I could not act rashly. I could not reveal my understanding too soon. My parents' assumptions, that I was compliant, pliable, and naive, were my greatest advantage. That night I sat by the window, letting moonlight spill across the hardwood. I traced the shadows stretching over the floor, thinking of the letters, the patterns, the hidden truths, and the faint outlines of a plan forming in my mind. Every subtle manipulation I had catalogued, every expectation they had assumed I would meet, could now be anticipated, countered, and ultimately neutralized. I realized something else. Too, the inheritance, the money, the legacy, they were secondary. The real inheritance was clarity, foresight, and the ability to move unseen, to act deliberately, to hold power quietly while others believed they held it. And in that quiet, silver-lit apartment, I felt the first real stirrings of control, the first whisper of inevitability, because they had underestimated me, and that would be their greatest mistake. I began to move differently, though nothing seemed to change on the surface. The apartment retained its calm, the city outside hummed its indifferent rhythm, and my parents' voices continued to drift in polite monotony whenever they appeared. But inside I had shifted. Every gesture, every word, every breath I took was deliberate, calculated. Power is rarely loud, it whispers. It observes, it waits. And I had begun to speak that language fluently. The first test came when my mother called unexpectedly, pretending to inquire about mundane matters, a recipe, a distant relative, the smallest, most inconsequential details. I let her speak at length, nodding silently, letting the pauses stretch just enough to unsettle her rhythm. I could sense her searching for compliance that wasn't there, for reactions that had been drilled into her expectations over decades. And I gave none. Instead, I asked questions of my own, subtle, gentle inquiries that appeared casual but carried weight. "Do you remember how Grandpa used to manage the accounts?" I inquired softly, tilting my head, fingers lightly tracing the rim of my mug. My voice was calm even, but the implication, that I knew more than they assumed, was heavy in the silence between us. The shift was immediate. A flicker of caution passed through her tone. She answered carefully, choosing words like stones thrown lightly into a pond, hoping I wouldn't see the ripples. My father's prideful assumptions were even easier to manipulate. He believed strength lay in dominance, in visible assertion. I allowed him to speak, to project authority, all the while cataloging and measuring every word. He did not see that my listening was active, my silence deliberate, my calm absolute. It is in quiet observation, I realized, that real power resides, in the unseen, the understated, the patient accumulation of information and insight. I began to craft subtle moves, small gestures meant to test their intentions, a mention of a distant relative's minor inheritance, an offhand remark about financial planning, all designed to draw out truth without confrontation. The results were illuminating. They revealed expectation, greed, and entitlement with each slight shift in posture, each hesitation, each carefully crafted answer. I recorded it all mentally, mapping them as I had with the letters, tracing patterns that would guide my next steps. In parallel, I strengthened my own position. calls to lawyers, quiet conversations with advisors I trusted implicitly, minor financial maneuvers that established invisible boundaries, all invisible to my parents, all deliberate. I created space for action, a buffer of preparation that no one could see, not even those who believed themselves to be guiding me. My world had become a chessboard, and I knew every piece's movement before it occurred. At night, I walked slowly around the apartment, letting the soft hum of the city anchor my thoughts. Shadows pooled in corners, long and deliberate, stretching across the hardwood in a visual echo of the subtle power I was amassing. I could feel it, a low vibration in my chest, the quiet surge of control that comes when preparation meets clarity. The apartment, my sanctuary, became a cathedral of strategy. Each room a different element of my plan, each object a reminder of patience, observation, and discretion. I realized, too, that this power was not aggressive. It did not need to be. It did not demand attention. Its strength was quiet, hidden beneath the surface, woven into everyday interactions, subtly bending expectation without ever forcing the issue. And the thrill of it, not in domination, not in revenge, but in recognition of my own foresight, was intoxicating. For the first time, I felt entirely untouchable, entirely myself, entirely in command of the narrative I had inherited as much as the fortune itself. And as the moonlight filtered through blinds, dust swirling like gold in the faint illumination, I understood something crucial. Power is most potent when it is unseen, when it moves quietly beneath the radar of those who underestimate you, and they would never see it coming. I had waited long enough. Weeks of observation, cataloging, reflection, and silent preparation had brought me to this moment, the first tangible step beyond strategy into action. The apartment smelled faintly of brewed coffee and wax from the candles I lit in the corners, soft amber light cutting across the room, casting shadows that moved like allies in my plan. Every sound, every dust mote suspended in the sunlight, felt amplified, deliberate, like punctuation in the sentence of my life. The first move was subtle, a probe disguised as casual conversation. I called my father, voice calm even, carrying a rhythm designed to put him at ease while concealing intent. "I've been thinking about the investments Grandpa set up," I said lightly, letting the words hang like a stone poised above water. "Some of the allocations seem outdated. I'd like your input before I make any changes." There was a pause, long enough to taste the tension. Then his voice, smooth, guarded, slipping just slightly at the edge. "Of course, Mariah. I'm happy to help." I smiled, though he could not see it, knowing that I had already planted a seed, a small suggestion that would lead him to reveal the extent of his assumptions, his expectations, and the truths he tried to disguise behind politeness. I followed up with subtle nudges over the next days. Questions about legal clauses, minor financial discrepancies, and the faintest hints of restructuring were thrown casually into conversations, all designed to expose attitudes, intentions, and hidden priorities. And, as always, they answered freely, revealing more than they realized. Their confidence, their assumed control, became my most powerful tool. At home, I mapped the responses meticulously, cross-referencing letters from my grandparents, the observations I had recorded during previous visits, and the subtle behavioral patterns I had cataloged over months. My apartment, quiet and dim, became a war room, every detail deliberate, every piece of information folded into strategy. The faint hum of the city below was my metronome, shadows on the hardwood floor, my visualization of the chessboard unfolding before me. Then came the first tangible shift. My mother, unaware of my observations, made an overt suggestion about redistributing part of the inheritance, a test, thinly veiled as concern for family unity. I let her speak, nodding thoughtfully, eyes soft, face serene. "I'll consider it carefully," I said quietly, letting the words imply deference while concealing the storm beneath. In that moment, she revealed more than she intended: her priorities, her assumptions, her sense of entitlement. Every syllable became ammunition, every pause a lever. I let the night absorb my satisfaction. I walked slowly around the apartment, candlelight flickering against walls, dust particles floating in thin beams like sparks of awareness. The quiet was intoxicating, the knowledge of unseen control electrifying. I was no longer just observing. I was testing, manipulating subtly, guiding the outcome without ever forcing it. My parents' sense of dominion was an illusion. I had quietly begun to reclaim my power. I paused at the window, watching city lights stretch into the distance, amber reflections in puddles from recent rain. The streets below were alive with people unaware of the careful movements of one young woman orchestrating her family's reckoning. I felt the first true thrill of possibility, the recognition that foresight and patience could reshape outcomes more effectively than confrontation ever could. And yet, even as I allowed myself this quiet victory, I understood the stakes. This was only the beginning. Every subtle nudge, every observed reaction, every small victory now carried momentum, but it was fragile. One misstep, one premature reveal, could undo months of careful planning. I sat on the edge of my sofa, fingers tracing the rim of my coffee mug, candlelight dancing across my hands. Outside, a crow cawed sharply, cutting through the quiet evening, and I smiled softly, knowing the first move had been made. They believed they were guiding the game, but in truth, I had been guiding it all along. The following days were a study in subtle escalation. I watched, recorded, and adjusted, each interaction another thread woven into the web I was quietly spinning around my parents. The apartment became both shield and observatory, soft light casting deliberate shadows that mirrored the patterns of control I had begun to exert. Each object, a lamp, a notebook, the faint stain of coffee on the counter, became a marker in the architecture of strategy. They visited again, smiling, polite, familiar, unaware that their every move was catalogued and interpreted. My mother's hand brushed the edge of the table repeatedly, the rhythm betraying impatience, while my father's eyes narrowed minutely, micro-expressions flickering across his face like a silent Morse code. I let the pauses stretch between sentences, allowing the weight of my silence to speak louder than any words I could utter. I initiated conversations that seemed casual, but were loaded with subtext. References to distant accounts, minor discrepancies in family investments, the slightest mention of alternative trusteeships, all designed to probe, to elicit truths they would not normally reveal. And as always, they responded with assumptions, arrogance, and subtle oversights, laying bare their intentions. The city outside pulsed quietly, indifferent to my scheming. Streetlights flickered over puddles from a recent rain, and distant traffic hummed like the rhythm of inevitability. Shadows from the blinds stretched long and thin across the hardwood, and I let my mind trace them like a roadmap of possibility. The web was tightening, each observation a node, each reaction a connection, and I began to see clearly the paths they thought they controlled, paths I now guided invisibly. I took care to maintain appearances. Polite smiles, soft laughter, casual nods, gestures designed to disarm, to keep them unaware of the control I had quietly assumed. They believed themselves orchestrating influence, yet it was I who had become the unseen director. Every suggestion I made, every question I posed, subtly recalibrated their expectations and revealed their weaknesses. Even in isolation, I reinforced the web. I reviewed letters from my grandparents, matched them against my parents' behavior, traced their manipulations over time, and noted where patterns diverged or repeated. Knowledge, I realized, was not static. It was dynamic, an evolving force that could be applied selectively to shift outcomes. My parents' arrogance had provided the perfect leverage. They assumed ignorance where there was calculation, passivity where there was observation. One evening alone, I traced my fingers over the outlines of diagrams I had drawn on paper, connecting threads, drawing arrows, plotting moves and countermoves. Candlelight flickered, dust floating in amber beams, the apartment silent except for the soft hum of the city. I felt the thrill of momentum, the intoxicating certainty that I was no longer merely responding. I was directing. And yet, beneath the satisfaction, I felt the tension coil tighter. Every thread in the web must hold. One misstep, one revelation, one premature move could unravel the careful lattice I had built. I allowed myself a slow, steady breath, tasting the weight of responsibility and the sharp sweetness of anticipation. By the time they left that night, the web was no longer just an abstract strategy. It had become a living force, stretching invisibly across the spaces they occupied, encircling them in subtle influence. They would never see it coming, and yet every action they took fed into its tightening threads, binding them to the reality I quietly controlled. I stood at the window long after the door closed, watching city lights shimmer across wet pavement, shadows twisting like silent witnesses. In the quiet, I whispered to myself, barely audible, a vow and a promise: the web is tight. The threads are mine. The game is far from over, but the pieces are moving exactly where I want them to. And the night, cool and deliberate, seemed to affirm it. It began quietly, as most things do, not with an explosion, but with a tremor. A missed call. A vague message. A question too specific to be accidental. The smallest fracture in the polished facade of my parents' composure. I recognized it immediately. The first sign that the web I'd spun so carefully had begun to tighten beyond their comfort. The unraveling did not come from me directly. It came through consequence, the natural gravity of deception when pulled too taut. I had introduced small inconsistencies into their assumptions, subtle contradictions that mirrored their own manipulations back at them. And like all people who mistake control for stability, they began to falter when the mirror no longer reflected what they expected. I watched it unfold from the sanctuary of my apartment. Candlelight flickered over the walls, soft and deliberate, while I sat cross-legged on the floor surrounded by papers, notes, and letters. The city outside was a dim, living thing, the sound of cars in the distance like waves, the occasional laughter from the street below sharp and fleeting. It felt as though time itself was holding its breath. My mother called first. Her voice carried a strain she tried to disguise, a careful tremor beneath practiced calm. "Mariah, we've been reviewing the estate records," she said lightly, "and it seems there are complications. Your name is attached to certain holdings that should have been under joint review." "Should have been?" I asked softly, not confrontational, just curious, the way one might ask about the weather. Silence. Then, "Well, your grandfather's lawyer must have misunderstood." I let the silence stretch. Silence can be a scalpel if you know how to hold it. When my father finally spoke days later, his tone was harsher, his pride more transparent. "You've been making moves without consulting us," he said. "Do you understand the optics of that?" "The optics," I replied slowly, "are only dangerous to those performing for an audience." He didn't respond immediately. I could almost hear the gears turning, the dawning realization that I wasn't asking for permission, that I had never needed it. That night, the air in my apartment felt electric, charged with the energy of unfolding events. The letters from my grandparents lay open across the table like scripture. Their words, once guidance, now read like prophecy. Guard against those who claim family but act from hunger. Protect the seed, not the noise. I could see their foresight everywhere. They had known this unraveling would come. They had known that truth, when handled with patience and precision, becomes the sharpest form of justice. The unraveling gained momentum. Emails misfired. Calls were forwarded. One of my parents' confidants, a cousin who fancied himself subtle, accidentally copied me on correspondence revealing their attempts to contest portions of the trust. The moment I read it, I understood. They were panicking. The illusion of control was dissolving, and panic is the most honest form of confession. Still, I did not gloat. I did not confront. I let it happen in silence, watching the unraveling with the same calm I had cultivated from the beginning. The candlelight burned low, the wax pooling at its base, flickering shadows bending like ribboned smoke across the ceiling. I breathed slowly, deeply, feeling the rhythm of inevitability pulse beneath the quiet. By the end of that week, the shift was complete. Their calls came less frequently, each one more brittle than the last. Their tone oscillated between guilt and anger, confusion and pride. I offered nothing but stillness. I did not defend myself. I did not attack. I simply held space, and in that silence, they confronted the truth of their own making. The unraveling wasn't loud. It wasn't cinematic in the traditional sense. It was quiet, almost graceful, like silk being pulled thread by thread from a tapestry that had long concealed its flaws. And as each thread fell loose, I could see the pattern of their intentions for what it was. Fragile, desperate, and small. That night, I sat by the window once more, the city lights stretching out like constellations beneath me. The air was cool against my skin, the kind of stillness that feels like the aftermath. I sipped the last of my coffee, bitter and grounding, and whispered softly into the night. It's unraveling, but it's not me coming apart. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like isolation. It felt like victory in its purest, quietest form. The day arrived quietly, deceptively ordinary. The air outside was sharp with early autumn, sunlight fractured through amber leaves, and the city moved in habitual rhythm, unaware that one small apartment held a storm contained only by patience and timing. I had prepared every detail, anticipated every reaction, and rehearsed my own restraint until it was instinct. The reckoning would not be loud, not dramatic in the conventional sense. It would be precise, inevitable, and entirely mine. I invited my parents over under the guise of a routine discussion, casual, familial, polite. They arrived smiling, oblivious, unaware that every step, every gesture, every carefully chosen word of mine had been designed to expose truth and exact accountability. I poured coffee, let the light fall on their faces, soft and even, shadows masking the intensity of my gaze. I waited. Silence, as always, was my ally. The first blow was subtle. I handed them documents they assumed were for casual review, but within the folds of paper lay every discrepancy, every manipulative attempt, every entitlement they had tried to assert over the years. Their eyes skimmed, scanning lines, absorbing numbers and notes, unaware that their own words had been archived and cross-referenced with meticulous care. "You've collected these?" my mother asked, voice caught between disbelief and fear. Her hand trembled slightly as it brushed the table. "I have," I said softly. My voice was calm, deliberate. "Every conversation, every suggestion, every attempt to influence me has been documented. Every intention revealed. It's all here laid bare." My father's posture stiffened. He leaned forward, the veneer of composure cracking. "Mariah, this is unnecessary. You know we only ever—" I interrupted gently, letting the words land softly but with weight. "I know exactly what you intended. And more importantly, I know what I am willing to allow." I paused, letting the silence punctuate the moment like a drumbeat. The inheritance is not a tool for control. It is a trust. And trust, once broken, cannot be reconstructed by excuses or charm. Their faces, so carefully practiced, began to reflect what I had long suspected: fear and recognition. Every polite deflection, every attempt at persuasion, every carefully measured smile, all futile. They were seeing the quiet force I had cultivated, and it was relentless in its inevitability. I laid out the consequences with precision. Not vengeance for the sake of emotion, but justice for the sake of integrity. Each point was clear, articulated calmly, drawing lines they had crossed. Each observation, each documented intention, each subtle act of manipulation became a mirror reflecting their own greed, their own assumptions. "You underestimated me," I said softly. "You assumed patience was compliance. You assumed silence meant surrender, but it doesn't. And it never did." I watched the tension crystallize, the subtle tremors in their composure, the flash of panic in their eyes. It was not cruel. It was necessary. It was accountability. Every carefully woven thread of manipulation they had spun now lay exposed under the light I had cultivated quietly over months. And as I watched, I realized something vital. The reckoning was not just theirs. It was mine as well. I had transformed the inheritance from a burden into a tool, the family's assumptions from constraints into levers of clarity. Power had shifted quietly, invisibly, completely. By the time the meeting ended, the air was heavy, golden light fading into the softer amber of evening. My parents left, quiet now, their faces etched with comprehension, their steps slower, measured, uncertain. I closed the door and exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. Alone, I walked to the window, watching the city lights flicker across wet streets from a recent drizzle. Shadows danced softly against walls, and I felt the delicate thrill of control achieved, responsibility met, and justice enacted. The reckoning had been delivered not in anger, not in spectacle, but in the quiet precision of observation, patience, and action. And for the first time, I allowed myself a smile, small but full, the weight of inevitability resting gently across my chest. The storm had passed, and the calm was entirely mine. The apartment was quiet that morning, the kind of stillness that feels like a held breath, suspended between what was and what could be. Sunlight spilled through the blinds in fractured beams, dust motes floating like tiny stars in the warmth. I walked slowly to the window, tracing the patterns on the hardwood, feeling the rhythm of calm after months of tension, strategy, and silent preparation. The house, the inheritance, the web I had woven around expectations and manipulation, all of it now rested in clarity. My parents' influence had been contained, their assumptions dismantled, not with aggression, but with precision, observation, and patience. And yet, the true victory was more than control. It was understanding. I had inherited not just money, but foresight, resilience, and the ability to define family on my own terms. I walked through the apartment, fingertips brushing surfaces, the edges of the table, the curve of the windowsill, the spines of notebooks filled with months of notes, observations, and plans. Each detail was a reminder of patience, of diligence, of quiet power. I had transformed inheritance from a battlefield into a blueprint, not for vengeance, but for integrity, for legacy. I thought of my grandparents, their careful foresight, their insistence on character over convenience, wisdom over convenience. They had left me the tools to navigate treachery, the patience to wait for the right moment, and the understanding that wealth is only meaningful when it reflects principle. I felt their presence as a gentle hum in the room, a soft affirmation that I had honored what they had entrusted to me. Outside, the city pulsed softly in morning rhythm. I could see neighbors walking, children laughing in distant yards, the occasional car glinting in sunlight on wet asphalt. Life moved forward, indifferent, yet connected. A quiet reminder that the actions we take ripple far beyond the confines of our perception. I realized my family had been only one node in a broader pattern, one test of my judgment and resilience, and now I had passed. I opened my laptop and drafted a note to the relatives, the advisors, the friends who had witnessed the quiet unfolding, thanking them for patience, discretion, and support. Then, deliberately, I closed it. No broadcast, no spectacle, just the satisfaction of completion. I stood, walked to the window again, and allowed myself a deep, unhurried breath. The storm was gone. The web had held. The inheritance was secure, but more importantly, so was my integrity. I picked up one last letter from my grandparents, one that had remained unopened until now. Their words were simple, yet resonant. The greatest inheritance is not gold or property, but the ability to act with wisdom, patience, and moral clarity. Guard it well. Shape the world quietly, deliberately, and faithfully. I folded it carefully, placing it back with the others, a reminder that true legacy is intangible, yet enduring. And then I did something small, symbolic, almost invisible. I deleted the draft of a note I had considered sending to assert dominance or prove a point. I didn't need it. Power had been exercised fully in silence, subtly, and with integrity. I left the laptop closed, the room suffused with warm sunlight, the quiet humming of the city below. I walked to the balcony, feeling the crisp air on my face, leaves rustling like whispered applause in the streets below. I planted a small, resilient flower in a pot I had brought months ago, its roots taking hold in soil I had prepared carefully. The act was simple, yet profound. Life, nurtured patiently, growing steadily, an emblem of endurance, foresight, and quiet triumph. The day unfolded slowly, deliberately, and in that stillness I understood that legacy is not about money claimed or control exerted. It is about the decisions we make when no one is watching, the patience we cultivate in silence, the clarity we bring to every choice, and the integrity we preserve through every storm. I looked out across the city one last time, amber light softening into gold, and whispered to myself, softly with certainty, "It is done. And it is mine, entirely, quietly, and forever." And in that quiet, golden light, I knew the story had found its rest, and so had I.